I know that I have a lot of non-UK audience on this channel. I also have a lot of UK people, obviously. But there's one thing I think, and I like to repeat this constantly, a lot of people really have to realise that Brexit really is rooted in our history, because a lot of Brexiteers are constantly talking about the fact that somehow we can turn back the clock and become this magnificent trading nation. Because to many Brexiteers, us joining the EU was not this, rise to power that it was. It was an absolute disaster. It was a shackling of the, United Kingdom down to a set of rules that, it was trapped under and couldn't really release its true potential. And what they are often talking about is essentially the end, really, of the British Empire, of essentially pretty much like the 20s right through up until we joined in the 70s. This period of British history, especially economically, is really not good. It was a period followed by massive decolonialization and massive deindustrialization, not because these jobs were particularly moving anywhere else, is because the country just could not compete in the modern world anymore. Times had moved on. And this is exactly what we're going to get into today, because this article pins it exactly of what the Brexiteers hoped to achieve but couldn't achieve in a month of Sundays. Because, as I've often said, and it may sound ridiculous to say, but this is really what a lot of these Brexiteers are often talking about, really. We cannot bring back the British Empire. So, please do hit that like and share button, and of course down below there are links to my Patreon page as well as a one-off donation link. So let's get into the article today, and also thank you very much to the people that do support me on those avenues. So this comes from The Guardian, and will we have a return of the Roaring Twenties? Fat chance when we are facing Brexit. Britain's return to the gold standard in 1925 has become a byword for self-inflicted economic fiascos. The idea was to seek stability by fixing the price of an ounce of gold on demand. Trade and confidence in the sterling would flood back, and Britain would continue with the Roaring Twenties, the boom that followed the First World War and the 1918 flu pandemic. However, the exchange rate was pitched so high that industry, instead of seamlessly adjusting to its prices and cost, was devastated. The consequent public austerity, deflation, and attempted wage cuts triggered mass unemployment and the general strike. But at the time, Conservative opinion was universally for it, and the Labour Party made no objection. Instead, Ramsay MacDonald's short-lived government 4 years later continued with the policy until it collapsed. The empire, free trade, and sound finance demanded no less. 100 years later, in a very different circumstances, amid hopes that we can emerge from lockdown into a soaring economic, is a self-parallel inflicted fiasco is playing itself out. The no deal or the fig leaf deal Brexit, rupturing trade relations with the EU, is now only a month away. And superimposed on the disaster of COVID, it will be regarded by future generations with incredulity that we regarded the return to the gold standard. British businesses if British businesses is to adjust as seamlessly and quickly as to the impending trade wrench as it meant to do the 1920s, 1925, to a vastly overhauled exchange rate. World economic preeminence will again magically return as global Britain, freed from regulatory change of socialist Europe, spearheads a new era of burgeoning free trade. And no matter that trade in 2020 is not in bulk cotton and coal, but in precious engineering, complex artifacts, and sophisticated business advice and services. The preconditions are mutually recognized standards, specifications, qualifications, and rules, and a negotiated framework in which sovereignty is shared to deliver the gains from trade. But Brexiteers, as then Chancellor Winston Churchill did in 1925, look to an imagined past. Britain is to be a sovereign free trader beholden to no one. This is a green light for hedge funds to speculate, for free ports to become paradises for anything goes capitalism, and ministers to spray cash at chums uncontested by EU rules. Mainstream businesses, despite its increasingly desperate warnings, and ordinary workers will have to take their chance. Once again, the Tory party and its press are mesmerised by quasi-imperialist delusions, and again, the Labour leadership is intent on slipstreaming in their wake. Brexit was the unmentionable in Chancellor Rishi Sunak's spending review last week, and it is widely commented that Johnson's ultra-hard Brexit is going to cost as much or more than COVID in lost jobs and even lost output, even as he blusters about this glorious opportunity. More seriously though, British economic policy is founded on increasing the national debt from its current 2 trillion to nearly 3 trillion in 2024. In the midst of a pandemic, this must be economically, strategically, and morally right, especially as borrowing costs are now negligible. However, Brexit forces a major qualification. As the former Bank of England Governor Mark Carney observed, every year that Britain's international accounts are uniquely and permanently in the red, our capacity to borrow at home and abroad depends on the kindness of strangers. As long as we retain their confidence, there is no maxing out on borrowing, as the individual might max out on a credit card, but lose that confidence and all hell breaks over us. Buried in the Office for Budget Responsibility, the economic outlook is forecast to inflict in Britain's internal current account will remain at a record 5% of national output for the next 4 years, and it will be worse if there is a no-deal Brexit. No advanced country has ever tried to borrow so much for so long, and at the same time as ruptured trade relations, that its capacity to export is way out of trouble and build vital great companies is dramatically weakened. Even the scant deal that Johnson might sign at the death will only marginally reduce the risk of economic calamity. COVID and the challenge of remaking British capitalism demands a high and serious thought about our plight, the absence of Brexiteer recklessness, and then, only then, will the strangers on whose kindness we depend will take note and actually carry on lending. First, there has to be a laser focus on lowering unemployment, dramatised by the collapse of Philip Green's retailing empire Arcadia, which includes Burton and Topshop. COVID is exposing the over-reliance of the British economy on the high street, with little to put in its place. Sunak has a partial response to the infrastructure spending, although inevitably it will be a slow burn, and a boost to the job centre network, but this is just poor tinder, and there is no match to set the job creation process alight. Britain needs more, much more. It needs a Rooseveltian network of rain-making agencies, whose mandate is proactively to bring together work-rich projects and unemployed people to work on them, putting the emphasis on the unemployed to find work themselves in a world without it is moral and economic turpitude. This needs to be supported by growing many more clusters of great companies to compensate for the Arcadias we are losing, and they need markets at home and abroad. At home, this implies promising to sustain public and private demand with continued high public borrowing, but with a credible framework so that the commitment is believed. An option gaining ground in the US is to commit to keeping interest payments on the national debt below 1% of the national income. This is credible and would allow trillions of borrowing headroom. But companies need overseas markets too. In the 1930s, Britain could use its empire as an extension of its home market. The only parallel option in the 2020s is the EU single market. Imagining the US, China, and India as alternatives is just fairground fantasy. We don't just need a Brexit deal, we need the full Monty. Membership, at least, of the EU single market and customs union, and although now it seems inconceivable, ultimately membership of the EU. There is no crisis-free way through to better times without it. So let's learn from history. And I keep on pointing this out that, British history is just going to unfortunately repeat itself. And until we actually learn that lesson, there ain't no way back. Hopefully, we learn it sooner than later. But I am heavily encouraged that the more and more we see the question asked and put to the British public was Brexit a good idea? More and more people are just saying no, it wasn't a good idea. So, as I once said many months ago, that we could be back sooner rather than later. That does indeed look like the possible trajectory of where we could end up going. So, with that said, thank you for watching. Please do remember to hit that like and share button. And of course, if you would like to support the channel a different way, there are links down below to my Patreon page, as well as a one-off link called Buy Me a Coffee, where you can, well, buy me a coffee. And of course, as always, thank you to everyone who does support me that way. And as always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you all next time.